Bonjour, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important for us here at MISC and at McGill more generally to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Centre for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the past, present, and future of Canada. In addition to our academic programs, we host public events such as today's book launch. And what is more Canadian than hockey? And so we are really glad to have Don Weeks with us today to talk about his wonderful and colorful book, Picturing the Game. And to introduce him with more details about his impressive bio, I would like to invite Lisa Quinn, Executive Director of McGill Queen's University Press. Lisa, it's all yours.
Merci Daniel et bienvenue, welcome everyone. I will just say a few words about McGill Queen's University Press. We are of course a partnership between McGill and Queen's University, publishing around 140 books a year. Of course scholarly books, but also books that are directly engaged in the study of Canadian culture, of which this book is a fantastic example. And I have the great pleasure today of introducing the author of this fascinating work, Don Weeks. Don is a Montreal hockey writer and researcher who has written more than 30 hockey books for Greystone Books in Vancouver, Firefly Books in Toronto, and now, of course, McGill Queen's University Press, including his work with the Hockey Hall of Fame. Don spent 31 years in media as a radio and television producer and director at Standard Broadcasting and at CTV, and is a member of the Society for International Hockey Research. He shoots left. Very important. And if you ask him about the Canadiens' rebuild, he will say, like most things in sport and life, their retool is a work in progress, so don't lose faith just yet. And as someone who passes the Bell Center every day when I come to work, I am learning very much about this wonderful sport. You are looking at a woman whose only sports jersey is Team Canada Women's Soccer. Don is here tonight to speak about his first book with McGill Queen's University Press, Picturing the Game, an illustrated story of hockey. In the review of their book, Policy Magazine wrote, "This book is a trip to the Hockey Hall of Fame, the National Gallery of Canada, and the Toronto Reference Library, all without having to leave the comfort of your couch on a snowy winter morning. It's a significant piece of scholarship worthy of a PhD, yet it's highly entertaining and very readable." And with those words, I am very pleased to introduce Don Weeks.
Hello, everyone. Oh, sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming on such a cold day, a typical hockey day. So that was planned after yesterday. Merci, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Lisa, for this kind introduction, and to McGill Institute for the Study of Canada for inviting me. Excuse me. As they say, it takes a village. Picturing the Game is the result of many people with a passion for books and reading. I am eternally grateful to everyone at McGill Queen's University Press for making Picturing the Game and its sales and publicity a reality. Lisa Quinn, Roy Ward, Jackie Davis, Jennifer Roberts, Kathleen Fraser, Elena, Ellie, book designer David LeBlanc, and copy editor Jared Toney. Thank you very much. And of course, publisher emeritus Philip Ciccone, for greenlighting the project. I greatly appreciate the family and friends who made it here today. You've also played a big part in this book. Two people that I would like to thank first, who participated in the book, is Jean-Patrice Martel. Raise your arm, please, just so everybody sees you. Jean-Patrice is definitely one of the best hockey historians in Canada, definitely in Quebec. He's fussy, exacting, and a pain in the butt. But he made the book right, or made the facts right. As well, I don't know if Nancy Clement is here. There she is. She's my legal counsel, and she saved me time and time again. And you know that. J'aimerais remercier l'Université de Montréal pour cette invitation. Je suis probablement honneur de parler ici après-midi. And personally, I want to also say I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to everyone for coming out on such a cold day. Okay, let's start. Excuse me, it's such a cold day. I have the sniffles. Excuse me. Okay, so I thought I would start with one of the editorials that inspired me to write this book, Picturing the Game. It's a simple drawing by the late and great Vancouver Sun cartoonist Len Norris. As you can see, a married couple in the center of the screen walks by a Quebec prison. The wife says to her husband, "It must be hockey night in Canada." Across the top, Norris is jotted, "Federal convict escapes while at hockey game." I didn't really understand Norris's cartoon until I dug deeper into the story. In 1973, this Norris cartoon ran across the country. Two prisoners were out on temporary absent passes from Cowansville Medium Security Penitentiary in the townships. As part of their social reintegration program, they had somehow secured Stanley Cup tickets to a Montreal-Philadelphia game at the Montreal Forum. During overtime, one Robert Moisin, a 25-year-old hold-up man, told his guard he had to call his mother. As one might suppose, Moisin never returned, making a clean getaway from his guard. That evening, the Canadians beat the Flyers 4-3 on a Larry Robertson goal at 6:45 in overtime. By that time, Moisin was long gone, and as we expect, certainly not to his mother's place. During the subsequent investigation, one mystified police officer could only concede in quotes, "I've been trying for years to get a ticket to a playoff game at the Forum." The Cowansville prison escape was a revelation to me. Here was an only-in-Canada hockey moment that had been long forgotten, that Norris had encapsulated in that small, weird corner of the editorial page where satire rules. After that, I was all in, fully invested in telling real hockey stories through the efforts of cartoonists and illustrators who wouldn't otherwise read, whom we wouldn't otherwise read about or know of. This book was supposed to be a 2 or 3 year project. It took 7 years. Thanks to my wife, Caroline, who is here in the audience. We're still happily married today. Isn't that right, dear? Turns out that 7-year journey of discovery led to a much bigger story that interprets and reinterprets our national game. For the first time, Canada's editorial cartoonists would tell their story of hockey, and because it involved the news of the day and the most bizarre, dark satire anywhere, well, that made it even better, and all the more interesting. Picturing the Game isn't just a performative work. For me, it had to be something substantive, something the reader could relate to, learn from, and laugh at. It's hockey history meets Canada's social and political history. So how does that work? Hockey is so well known to most in the country, cartoonists use it as analogy to explain the more complex events that affects all of our lives. Of course, I didn't have any idea at the time what I was getting myself into when I started. I knew nothing about editorial cartooning. But I did love this cartoon by Aislinn. Mount Royal's cross is adorned by the CH of Le Canadien. The joke, the cleverness, the message is immediate. Hockey is religion in Quebec. It's brilliant in that we still understand it today, 16 years after it was first drawn, all thanks to both the fact-based and make-believe schizoid world of cartooning. Here's another favorite of Guy Lafleur by Serge Chapleau. Chapleau caricatures the aging star in full flight. Lafleur always looked like his speed. Here he bears a monstrous honker and receding blonde mop of hair that exposes his sleek forehead. All Chapleau exaggerations drawn to demonstrate Lafleur's famous speed on the ice. Despite what it looks like, this cartoon is a tribute, as only satire can do. We should all be so honored to be able to laugh at ourselves so elegantly. Each cup victory, each scoring crown, every personal honor in Lafleur's illustrious career was reduced to something so trivial as his hair. Once a symbol of his strength and now an allegory of his demise, Chapleau exploited that imperfection flawlessly. These kinds of works by Aislinn, Norris, Chapleau bring a completely unique perspective to the game and how the game can politicize the dodgy politicians, the corrupt business leaders, the sometimes disreputable sports bosses. They are all fodder. I think that's wonderful. I should have said that more emphatically. I think that's wonderful. As we see here, in Susan DeWar's take on the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who, as we know, is a true hockey historian in his own right. After toying with voters' emotions over a possible Quebec Nordiques return, DeWar turned Harper into a puck-pandering politician seeking some election payoff. Harper sports a goofy buffalo hat with hockey sticks on horns and brandishes a loaded revolver. It was the classic political stick-up from the sort of politician who soberly offers to bribe us with our own money, noted columnist Alan Fotheringham. It seems little has changed today, with our present Quebec government spending $7 million in public money to bring the Los Angeles Kings to Quebec City to play exhibition games. This art of cartoonists connecting hockey and hard news stories often transcends sport. It settles into that very special category, Canadiana. Yet their influence on public opinion is unprovable, yet undeniable. As others have observed, they didn't change much in this country, except maybe our hearts, our minds, and the way we understand ourselves. This editorial is probably Canada's most familiar contemporary hockey cartoon. I can just look down here. Again, without saying a word, Bruce McKinnon tells us of the nationwide pain we all felt for the people of Humboldt, Saskatchewan, after a tragic bus crash in 2018. McKinnon presents this haunting metaphor of Humboldt, where tragedies have a way of bringing people together, as injuries do with teammates. Each player represents a Canadian province, helping Saskatchewan off the ice. This is very much about hockey, but also about us as a people. As McKinnon inferred, we are our brother's keeper. Unfortunately, it takes a tragedy sometimes to remind us of that. On a strictly political bent, here's Duncan McPherson's take on Canada's struggle with bilingualism and biculturalism in 1962. This happens to be one of my favorite cartoons in the book, by the way. McPherson was reacting to opposition leader Lester B. Pearson's call for a federal provincial inquiry into the status of the country's English and French cultures. The Royal Commission, known as the B&B Report for Bilingualism and Biculturalism, was long overdue. and very important to the nation's future. So McPherson featured hockey greats Red Kelly and Bernie Geoffrion, the Maple Leafs versus Les Canadiens, which of course personified English versus French. In their Canadianness, McPherson's Kelly and Geoffrion are outwardly polite and apologetic. Excusez-moi, boom, boom, pardon me, pardon my stick, Kelly. Was outwardly polite and apologetic, as we often see ourselves as Canadians, except they have their sticks and elbows up, ready to do battle, as we are also accustomed to do when pushed. This is among the earliest hockey cartoons using and identifying star players to fully satirize politics, and this is 1962. To make light of a more current polarizing issue, here's Bruce McKinnon's take on Bill 21, which prohibits religious symbols in public sector services, or maybe. McKinnon broadened the controversy over the ban on religious headwear to include Montreal's own secular saint, Carey Price. In social affairs, this editorial enlightens the charged atmosphere on the HIV scare among NHL players in 1991-92. In comic optimism, Theo Moudakis imagines how Canadiens coach Pat Burns might have the safe sex talks with his players. Here he employs a step-by-step chalkboard diagram explaining in detail how a condom works. It does bring into sharper focus the seriousness of sexual assault cases plaguing men's hockey today. We address that topic in Picturing the Game as well. The first hockey artwork around 1900 rarely poked fun at our winter game or the politics of that time. Hockey drawings back then focused on conventional renderings like this to acquaint us with hockey's look. Women's hockey was no different. The imagery here from 1900 wasn't nearly as available, or the imagery like this one wasn't nearly as available in newspapers. Despite being patronized and marginalized for not being fast enough or physical enough, women still found hockey fun to play. They competed for ice time and earned little publicity or money at the gate. Many games were informal, often played at charity events. Thankfully, that's changing today with the arrival of the WPHL, the Professional Women's Hockey League. It's good action, exciting, and the games happily are completely sold out. Here's Canada's Captain Clutch. You can see the double C below. That's Marie Poulin's nickname, Marie-Philippe Poulin's nickname. This caricature was drawn by Anthony Jenkins. Believe it or not, serious painters and artists also moonlighted as cartoonists in early hockey. This cartoon, titled Be the Hokey Pokey, is by C.W. Jeffries. An artist and historian, Jeffries sidestepped the important work of chronicling the development of Canada in his oil paintings long enough to draw some of the era's best political satire. Inspired by the game's distinctive play, Jeffries' sketch of 1892 is a Toronto souvenir of that Victorian generation when the hockey stick was still a curiosity and the sport's unusual name, hockey, worthy of teasing. Here referencing Hokey Pokey, the old British traditional folk song and dance. As it happens, Hockey Pokey may be Canada's first authentic hockey cartoon. It's the oldest one I've found to date, drawn more than 130 years ago. Almost every period in our history has some form of hockey artwork, dating to Confederation in 1867. By the early 1880s, the first images of game action were being drawn. At that time, editorial cartoonists were cementing their most resilient tropes and themes, including a uniquely Canadian shorthand of meaningful national symbols like Johnny Canuck, the beaver, maple leaf, the toque-wearing habitant, and naturally the analogy of dancing, of dangers of skating on thin ice. Johnny Canuck was particularly interesting. Here he is in his wide-brimmed Stetson hat, standing between Uncle Sam and John Bull, the two cartoon personifications of America and colonial Britain. Johnny was that period's most iconic Canadian cartoon figure. He was Canada's Uncle Sam, albeit more amiable and less chauvinistic. Johnny was an adaptable fellow, invented to reflect Canada's struggles with nationhood. He typically appeared resisting America's big brother influence on sensitive trade issues, border disputes, and other bilateral matters facing the two countries. Oddly, I never found cartoons of Johnny on ice with a hockey stick in his hand. This is a puzzle to me. Johnny should have been an obvious symbol for satirists, given his patriotic bearing and America's influence over Canada's game, its economics, and its distinct vulnerabilities. Throughout this period, though, it seems Johnny was rarely politicized in hockey cartoons. Some of this can be attributed to the game being new around 1900. Hockey hadn't fully penetrated the Canadian consciousness yet. Illustrators and cartoonists rarely drew the game in any real satirical way, at least not as they do today. Like this. For example, Tim Dolligan's version of Commissioner Gary Bettman. You wouldn't see that in 1900, no way. This cartoon appears thanks to Bettman's last lockout in 2012-2013. Or this one by Aislinn. Oh, everyone gets it right away, huh? On the decline of the Canadians, a fan celebrates simple 8th place playoff berth like it was a Stanley Cup championship. As some of us remember, those cup parades were once an annual rite of spring in Montreal. While on Aislinn, his greatest contribution to hockey cartooning came in 1972. He's a big sports fan, baseball fan more than hockey, but he's, being in Montreal, come to love the Canadians. Came in 1972 during the seminal Canada-Soviet Summit Series. Aislinn acquired the most, this is interesting, Aislinn acquired the most privileged roost among cartoonists. After filing cartoons for the first Canadian games from Toe Blake's Tavern, the Gazette artist found himself jetting to Moscow to illustrate Jack Ludwig's book, Hockey Night in Moscow. Besides his sketch pad and pens, Aislinn went equipped with photo equipment and bogus photographer credentials, a dodge to conceal his occupation as a political cartoonist from the Soviet authorities. Assigned to the press section at ice level, Aislinn took every opportunity to draw the goings-on of the series. This actually was a postage stamp that came out last year. Here, series star Phil Esposito is drowning in pucks at the bottom of the hourglass, saying we're still number one, with time running out on Canadian hockey. As we know, Canadian pride swung the series. We won, but by the narrowest of margins. One of Canada's first and foremost important political cartoonists was Arthur Racy. He lived in Westmount, graduated from this very campus of McGill University, and worked at the Montreal Star until his death in 1941. His editorials were known around the world. A few even hung in the White House, some sources say. The editorials and artwork of Arthur Racy made me realize there's something here that's worth writing a book. This Arthur Racy cartoon from March 1905 ridicules game brutality. A defiant brawler is perp-walked from the rink by a police constable. The policeman carries a billy club labeled Law and Order. As you can see, the billy club, it has Law and Order there, and on the player's jersey is brutality. The policeman carries a billy club labeled Law and Order, a good versus evil counterpoint to the player's preferred club, a hockey stick dripping in blood, as you can see near the bottom. With Racy's own comments at the very bottom, he must go. The cartoon appeared following the on-ice death of Alcide Lorrain in an Ontario seniors game between Alexandria and Maxville. Alan Looney was charged with manslaughter and wielding the stick that killed Lorrain. The case went to court. Looney was found not guilty, but had he been convicted, reports said he could have been hanged. I had known about the on-ice deaths of early hockey before, but not the particulars of which there are many in this case. So, where did all this research come from and take me? It took me to dozens of archives, libraries, and museums, including almost weekly visits to McGill during a few years. I made 40 visits to Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, where if I could find an original drawing of a cartoon, if I couldn't find an original drawing of the cartoon, I found the next best thing, the original hard copy print of newspapers where they first appeared. This led me to these massive binders of ancient newspapers and special collections at Library and Archives Canada. They don't appear to be that big, but you can see by the skates that they're considerable size. They're probably about 3.5 feet high. These newspapers were true broadsheets, and that's no exaggeration. When spread out, they are the size of small kitchen tables or a desk, about 3.5 feet by 2.5 feet. They are so old, individual pages flake apart in your hands. Well, this is what the book looks like. There are my glasses in the bottom corner. It gives you a perspective of what you're seeing. You can see in the upper right of this original 1905 edition of the Montreal Star, this Arthur Racy cartoon that we just saw before. There it is up in the corner. It's featured on page 21 of Picturing the Game. This is what the images that we shot in Library and Archives Canada, and then we color corrected and so on. Here's another Arthur Racy cartoon from 1906. A fan on bended knee being strong-armed and bullied by arena managers to pay you sucker pay. Racy is slamming arena owners for staging a cash grab by inflating ticket prices during postseason. One would assume that price gouging went on as a normal course of events, especially for big games like the upcoming Stanley Cup Challenge between Montreal and Ottawa that year. You see at the bottom it says the Wanderers-Ottawa match, Wanderers being the Montreal Wanderers. This is something we can really relate to today. Playoff tickets are easily double or triple regular season prices and higher. Here, Arthur Racy provided the proof that price gouging did happen back then. And in only a couple of seconds, the time it took to read this cartoon. And as a researcher with select time, I appreciate that. By today's standards, this cartoon looks rather tame, but back then, again, no one dared graphically ridicule game concerns so sharply. It's a guess, but this cartoon probably hasn't been seen in more than a century. Arthur Racy is important enough to take a few minutes to explain his Montreal and McGill backgrounds and how he came to satirize hockey's ongoing concerns so robustly. This is the only picture that I have of him. Unlike his peers, Arthur Racy's code of accountability held everyone's feet to the same fire. He drew without apology in blunt, blistering attacks. Born in 1870, Arthur Racy witnessed the game from its pioneering days at Montreal's winter carnivals of the 1880s. He was around to see Lord Stanley's Cup determine Canada's first champions in 1883. At the time, Racy was 23 years old and attending McGill University, where he witnessed organized hockey get its Anglo-Protestant start, and where he developed his keen interest in cartooning. Little is known of Arthur Racy's enthusiasm for sports or if he played hockey. He certainly had a ringside seat to its seminal roots and early popularization. I believe that proximity to history emboldened a game fluency that made him hockey's harshest critic at the time. At the Montreal Star, he became an institution and developed a worldwide reputation both as a gifted editorialist and as a painter, renowned for his watercolors. In my research, I learned something about newspaper history in Canada. It's interesting, actually, very interesting. As we know, except for the Telegraph, the newspaper was once our only mass communicator. This may seem obvious, but the newspaper became the mass medium that made hockey Canada's national game. It was as invaluable as television and the internet is today. And because photography couldn't capture the fast action on slow film in the ambient lighting of arenas, newspapers relied on illustrators and cartoonists to show off the game. In fact, many of the early builders of hockey worked in the press first. Sometimes they did both jobs at once. Yes, it was a conflict of interest, but also a neat pact. Newspapers sold fans on the game, and the game helped sell more newspapers. Perhaps the most fascinating early discovery is what I call the game cartoon. It evolved from the American graphic invention known as the sports cartoon by cartoonists like Tad Dorgan of the San Francisco Bulletin and later of various New York papers. They drew the great story of boxing during the early 1900s when Jim Jeffries, Jack Johnson, and others were in the ring. Their sports cartoons were a series of vignettes, often surrounded by one or more central figures. For those who didn't read a lot, or as described in those days, the unaccustomed reader, this is how many learned of the big events in sports. Artists in Canada soon picked up on the sports cartoon idea. This image is drawn by Russell Patterson from February 1913. An NHA game that won the Stanley Cup for Quebec City. The important plays of this game are here, especially a big ongoing fight in the middle of the screen between Newsy Lalonde and Joe Hall. These game cartoons were once a staple in some newspapers. They are the origins of TV's highlight reel package. They survived about 2 or 3 decades until 1930 or so. So we know of the acerbic cartoons of Arthur Racy, but what did the typical cheery cartoon look like? They often resembled this 1939 editorial on the serious subject of unemployment in the Depression era. A snow blizzard is used as an analogy to explain how bad things were for Canada's labor force. However, these cartoons played well in times of economic depression and world wars. In the spirit of all editorial cartoons, they challenged society's inequalities, unmasking dishonest business leaders and the politicians who misspent public money. Incorporating ideas that wouldn't sway us today, they delighted readers with overworked cliches like riding the bumpy road to economic recovery, sowing the seeds of public discontent, poisoning the well of prosperity. Drawing a tiger represented hunger. Wolves at the door symbolized poverty. Political figures were regularly portrayed as turkeys, lame ducks, and of course, pigs at the trough. Hockey was used as well, but typically without much satire until the 1950s. In 1947, the Ford Motor Strike was on everybody's mind. A workforce of 11,000 members were striking. Les Callan obliged with this hockey-themed cartoon. 18 months of negotiations had sparked the picketing and 2-day blockade of the automaker's Windsor plant during the bitter 3-month strike. Here, labor and management are in hockey's defensive strategy of playing the man instead of the puck. The tactic upends the nation's progress, seen here in the player flying in the air. This allowed the elusive puck of recovery to sit idle, the puck at the bottom of the screen. Arbitration finally settled the dispute on December 19th, 6 days after Les Callan's editorial appeared. The strikers returned to their jobs with both sides agreeing to a unionized shop. Callan work illustrates how cartoons could faithfully mend news and sport, but in a mild-mannered way. This 1939 cartoon, war cartoon, is by Ivan Glasgow of the Hamilton Spectator. There's no hard-hitting satire here either. Who here can figure out what this is all about? It speaks to the very serious issues Prime Minister Mackenzie King's government was drawn into leading up to World War II. Known for his mordant touch of humor, Glasgow crafted a purely visual cartoon. He relied on simplicity, the trickiest of all creative subtleties. Glasgow critiques the dire circumstances facing Canada and the government's lack of combat readiness to defend our vast geography. He draws 3 pint-sized players guarding a huge, gaping hockey net, that net being Canada. Each tiny player represents a different branch of military service: Army, Navy, and Air Force. Some 80 years later, its simplicity and surprise value practically explains itself. Little context is needed to appreciate the overwhelming threat facing the nation. So grave a situation, figured Glasgow, Canadians really could use a therapeutic chuckle. Simply, our government wasn't ready for another world war. Like most in the media, cartoonists became war propagandists for the home front. Toronto's Lou Scooce was famous across Canada and the world during the first half of the 20th century. In World War I, his artwork blanketed the country in publicity promoting victory bonds and sheet music for patriotic tunes. Scooce's newsprint offerings projected a similar stirring nationalism. In Scooce's Fall In, a hockey player eyeballs an army recruiting poster that reflects what military commanders and civilians contended about sports' ability to turn boys into men for war. The player says that would be a great way to keep in good condition. It wasn't unusual to see news articles of hockey's merits as a maker of superior soldiers. Scooce teased the opposite here, arguing that soldiering is excellent for training for hockey. Scooce's work was so seamless, you couldn't tell if this was a war cartoon mocking hockey or the opposite, a hockey cartoon mocking the war. I do wonder what readers thought of it when it first appeared in March 1915, shortly after war erupted in Europe. Like Arthur Racy, during this era, Scooce was a celebrity with an international reputation. Millions of readers followed his humor. The artwork of Scooce and others were exhibited in art galleries. They decorated the walls of prominent restaurants, nightclubs, and NHL arenas for decades. Even into the 1950s, newspaper bosses and editors still saw sports as entertainment. And as always, there was that too close relationship between the press and sports teams. This is what kept many cartoonists drawing in that same mundane manner. This changed considerably with the social and political revolution of the 1960s. In cartooning, the change really began in the late 1950s with Duncan McPherson, Len Norris, and Quebec's own Robert Lapalme. The days of the cheery, upbeat cartoon was coming to an end. Duncan McPherson and Robert Lapalme would soon bring true skeptical scrutiny to cartooning, reorienting the game's spirit in bolder, uncompromising work to better inform Canadians about themselves and current affairs, often in truths that might otherwise be unknown or misrepresented. Here's Lapalme's editorial of the Richard riot. La Rançon de la Gloire, The Price of Fame, is among the few French cartoons to present Maurice Richard in an unflattering light. While many English cartoons appeared in the dailies, this is the only depiction of the famous Richard riot published by a major French daily in Montreal at the time. True, Lapalme was a political cartoonist first and seemingly had little interest in hockey, but this illustration suggests where Canadian cartooning was headed. Look at this biting Aisling cartoon of NHL President Clarence Campbell in the early 1970s. Campbell at the time was an institution, but here he is both a puppet master of the players and a puppet to league owners. Besides Lapalm's cartoons, this is one of the earliest examples of a prominent hockey figure being so properly lampooned by name. Now, with no set gags or established practices to follow for cartoonists, everything was fair game for them. That didn't mean cartoonists were any less funny. Rather, they just wouldn't be confined to being funny. So now that the gloves were off, untethered by editorial constraint, cartoonists could finally swing big and draw timely work that wounded. As we have already seen, almost nothing is off limits today, including scathing editorials on violence, the NHL lockouts, and the sexual assault and abuse cases that have enveloped Hockey Canada in 2022. Several editorials of these episodes appear in the book. Among the few last cartoons presented today, perhaps is one on our most challenging issue facing the planet, climate change. Kind of cool. Under the vigilant eye of Bruce McKinnon, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's conservative blueprint for environmental inaction presented this scenario. In 2006, the federal government was muzzling scientists, effectively preventing them from giving interviews to journalists. I'm sure we all remember that. McKinnon looked to hockey to recap what critics claimed was Harper's government opposition to fighting global warming. Harper plays the crooked referee who silently backs industry as he pummels away at the defenseless environment. I had several last cartoons available for today's presentation. I chose this one by Dale Cummings called Beaver Stew. I think it sums up everything that Canadians feel about the NHL game. Time to bring Stanley home. Maybe not to Montreal this year, but perhaps to Winnipeg, Vancouver, or even, dare I say, the Maple Leafs. Merci, and thank you very much to everyone who made it to McGill today. Thank you again.